I still don't know how it started with a door. That's the part people always want to skip when I tell this story. They want to get to the fighting. They want to get to the part where I'm standing in the middle of a ring of 7-foot alien women who are all staring at me like I'm either the most interesting thing they've ever seen or something they want to dismantle slowly. I get it. That's the part worth hearing. But if I skip the door, none of it makes any sense. And the thing about this story is, it's almost entirely about things that didn't make sense, until suddenly they did all at once in the worst possible way. So the door. There's a station called Veth Mora. Most people on Earth have never heard of it, which is fine, because most people on Earth have never been invited to orbit their own planet on a 7-kilometer ring of alien architecture that smells like burnt copper and sounds like a waterfall you can't quite locate. Veth Mora is a galactic cooperative administration hub. Officially, it's a diplomatic and logistics way station. Unofficially, and I learned this approximately 18 hours into my assignment, it is one of the most politically complicated pieces of real estate in the known galaxy, because it sits in Earth's gravitational neighborhood, and about 40 different species all claim some kind of ancestral, spiritual, commercial, or military interest in being the ones who get to manage it. Humans showed up late to that argument, which was typical, and we got assigned the smallest residential wing and the second worst cafeteria. Also typical. I've been posted to Veth Mora as part of the 7th Human Rapid Integration Detachment, which is a fancy name for a program where they take junior military personnel, low-ranked, adaptable, ideally not prone to panicking when something with 4 mouths tries to shake your hand, and embed us in mixed-species environments to learn how the galaxy actually operates. The theory is that we build relationships and gather intelligence and demonstrate human capability in non-combat contexts. The reality was that I had been on station for 36 hours, and I had mostly been lost. Veth Mora's design doesn't follow any logic a human brain is built to parse. The corridors curve in directions that feel wrong. Gravity shifts slightly between sections because different species need different atmospheric pressures, and the transitions are marked by color-coded bands on the floor that mean specific things to species whose visual spectrum is different from ours. So I was constantly walking into zones where the gravity pulled at a 10-degree angle I wasn't expecting. Signage was in 8 languages, none of which was English, though my translation implant caught about 60% of it, and the rest was mostly educated guessing. My bunk assignment was in Section 14 Cyan. The integration briefing office, where I was supposed to check in, was in Section 22 Teal. In human terms, those sound similar. They are not. Teal and Cyan on Veth Mora are separated by 4 gravity transitions, 2 species-specific atmospheric corridors, and a central hub chamber the size of an aircraft hangar, where about 300 beings from assorted planets are usually in transit at any given moment. I had been trying to reach Section 22 Teal for about 40 minutes. What I had actually reached, because I was following the blue-green band on the floor with the dedication of someone who absolutely refuses to ask for help, was a section of the station I had never seen referenced in any briefing document. The corridor here was wider than the ones I'd come through. The walls were a dark alloy I didn't recognize, darker than the titanium composite panels in the human wing, almost black, with a faint internal luminescence that pulsed slowly, like a resting heartbeat. The floor had a different texture. It wasn't the smooth honeycomb panel that most of Veth Mora used. It was ribbed, aggressive grip, the kind of surface you design when you expect people to be running on it, or fighting on it, or both. I should have known something was different. I noticed it. I genuinely noticed all of those things. I noted them with the part of my brain that was cataloging sensory data. And then the other part of my brain, the part running on 36 hours of disrupted sleep and 2 ration bars, and the particular kind of low-grade desperation that comes from being hopelessly lost, just kept following the blue-green floor band because it was the only plan I had. The door I came through was large, I'll say that. It was a proper blast-rated sliding panel, the kind with magnetic seals and a status light over the frame. The status light was green, which on most stations means, entry permitted, space is occupied, come on in. I came on in. The room on the other side was enormous. My first impression was, training facility. That was right, as it turned out, but it took me a moment to process everything else because there was a lot of everything else happening simultaneously. The space was roughly circular, maybe 40 meters across, with a vaulted ceiling that had to be 15 meters at its peak. The walls were lined with weapons racks, real weapons, not display pieces. Blades, energy weapons, things I had no name for. There were combat mats on the floor in concentric rings. There was specialized equipment bolted to the walls and suspended from ceiling tracks that I couldn't identify, but which had the aesthetic language of training apparatus. The shapes of things designed to make people stronger and faster and harder to kill. There were also 9 women in that room. And I use women in the broadest possible sense, because they were female, obviously, demonstrably, unmistakably female by the standards of their respective species. And there were 9 of them, and they were all, without exception, extraordinary. Not in a gentle or decorative way. In the way that a very well-maintained weapon is extraordinary. In the way that something specifically designed to be the most effective version of itself is extraordinary. They were from at least 4 different species. I recognized 2 of them as Cathar, tall, bipedal, with the distinctive double-jointed knee structure, and the iridescent gray skin that shifts toward violet under certain light. I recognized one as a Vorok, because there is no mistaking a Vorok. 2.5 meters of layered exoskeleton, 4 functional arms, a face that is all sensor cluster, and no expression a human can read. The others I couldn't immediately place, which meant they were either species I hadn't been briefed on or species I had been briefed on in such cursory terms that I hadn't retained the identifying characteristics. They were all in the middle of a training exercise when I walked in. Not all doing the same thing. Some were sparring in pairs. One was running a weapons drill against a hollow target system. 2 were watching and coaching, which I understood from their posture even before my translation implant caught fragments of what they were saying. And then I walked in and the status light over the door behind me shifted from green to red as it sealed, and the particular acoustics of a sealed pressurized chamber swallowed the sound of that click, and one of the Cathar women, the one who had been coaching, standing at the edge of the nearest sparring mat, turned around. She looked at me. I looked at her. My translation implant gave me a half-second delay on processing the language she spoke, which meant I heard the sounds first and the meaning second, which is a deeply uncomfortable way to receive communication that you later recognize was important. The sounds Vethrao Kosti. The meaning half a second later, new arrival. You are late. I had time to process approximately 0% of that situation before she had already turned back to the group, said something rapidly that my implant caught as integration transfer, noted, and the training exercise resumed. I stood at the door for about 4 seconds. Then I did the thing I am least proud of in this entire story, which is, I didn't say anything. I didn't correct her. I didn't say, I think there's been a mistake, or I'm looking for Section 22 Teal, or I am a confused 23-year-old corporal from Lagos who followed a floor stripe into what appears to be a special forces ready room. I didn't say any of that. I stayed, partly because the door was sealed behind me, and I didn't know how to open it from this side. Partly because the woman who had spoken to me, the Cathar, had already moved on, clearly expecting me to figure out whatever came next without further instruction. Partly because something in the room's atmosphere had shifted the moment she'd acknowledged me, something subtle and directional, like a current in water changing angle, and I had the sudden, very clear instinct that leaving immediately would be significantly more complicated than staying quietly for a few minutes, while I figured out how to communicate that there had been a mistake. And partly, I will be honest, I will be completely honest here, because the room was fascinating. The Cathar woman's name was Vesa. I didn't learn that for another 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, I stood near the wall and watched the training exercise with the focused attention of someone who is very aware that they are in a situation they don't entirely understand, and who is attempting to compensate through observation. What they were doing was called, I later learned, a KAMAR, a combined discipline integration drill. The concept is straightforward. A unit runs combat scenarios simultaneously in different subgroups, then rotates, so that over the course of the session every member has trained with every other member in every combination. The purpose isn't to get better at fighting individually. It's to map each other. To understand how each body moves, what each fighter's instincts are, how the different species in the unit complement or compensate for each other. It is, as military training methodologies go, one of the most sophisticated things I have ever seen. I knew I shouldn't be there. I knew that. I want to be very clear that I knew. But I also knew, within about 6 minutes of watching, that I was observing something that no human had probably ever seen, and that the integration briefing office in Section 22 Teal was going to have to wait just a little while longer. Vesa ran the drill with an economy of motion that was almost geometric. She didn't waste words. When she corrected someone, and she corrected several of the women during that session, in ways I could understand even without my implant catching all the specifics, she did it with a touch, or a repositioning, or a single sharp syllable that carried so much precision it landed like a physical thing. She was clearly the unit commander, or something equivalent to it. The other women responded to her with the kind of instant, automatic compliance that doesn't come from authority imposed from outside. It comes from authority earned, repeatedly, over time. About 30 minutes in, one of the sparring pairs on the near mat rotated out, and the woman who rotated in, another Cathar, younger looking, with a fighting style that was faster and less controlled than the others, glanced at me where I was standing near the wall. She said something. My implant translated, "You're not observing from the edge, come participate or get out." I said, in the halting galactic standard I had been drilling for 6 months, I was not planning to interrupt you. She had already turned away. And then she turned back, because something I'd said or the way I'd said it had caught her attention, and she looked at me with an expression I was starting to be able to read, the Cathar equivalent of moderate surprise. "You speak standard with an Earth accent," she said. "Yes," I said, "I am from Earth." A beat of silence. She glanced toward Vesa. Vesa was on the other side of the room and didn't look over. "Earth humans are not assigned to Cathar Vanguard integration units," the young Cathar said. I started. "And yet," she said, "the door logged you as integration personnel. There may have been a—" "Vesa logged it," she said. "When logs something, it is logged." She looked at me for another 2 seconds. Then she said, "What is your combat specialization?" And that, right there, was the second decision point where I could have stopped everything. Where I could have said, "I'm a logistics and integration support specialist. I don't really have a combat specialization. I took 12 weeks of hand-to-hand combat training 18 months ago, and I'm reasonably accurate with a sidearm within controlled conditions." That's what I should have said. What I said instead was, "close quarters and some weapons." Which was true, technically. The young Cathar looked at me for one more second. Then she said, "I am Ritha, warm up." Part 2, the thing about Cathar training. I need to explain something about Cathar physiology before this next part makes sense. Cathar are not human-sized. The average Cathar female stands somewhere between 1.9 and 2.1 meters, and masses about 30 to 40% more than a human of the same height, with a skeletal structure built around impact absorption in ways human bones simply aren't. The double-jointed knees I mentioned aren't just an aesthetic peculiarity. They're a biomechanical adaptation that allows Kethar to redirect kinetic force through their lower body during impact events in ways that would shatter a human femur. Their grip strength is, conservatively, 3 to 4 times what you'd measure in a human athlete of comparable size. They are also very, very fast. Faster than they look, which I think is partly cognitive. My brain kept assessing Kethar movement speed relative to their mass, and arriving at predictions that were consistently wrong because human intuition calibrates for human bodies. I knew all of this from briefing documents. There is a significant difference between knowing something from briefing documents and knowing it because a Kethar named Ritha has just taken you through a physical warm-up sequence at a pace that makes your vision go slightly white at the edges. The warm-up was 20 minutes, not Kethar-intensive 20 minutes that I was somehow surviving at the low end of. Actual warm-up 20 minutes. Dynamic stretching, movement patterns, the kind of systematic joint mobilization that a high-level athlete does before serious work. I did it. I kept up mostly with adaptations at the edges. There were movements that my hip flexors simply refused to reproduce in the same range, and a couple of the ground patterns required a flexibility I didn't have in my thoracic spine. But I kept up with the broad structure of it. Ritha watched me without commenting, which I was starting to understand was not the same as Ritha ignoring me. After the warm-up, the unit rotated into a new phase of the Kamar. Ritha gestured for me to follow her to the edge of the space, where a section of combat mat was unoccupied. "Show me your guard," she said. I stood in the guard position I'd been trained in. Standard human military close quarters, weight balanced, hands up, chin down. Ritha walked around me once, slowly, like she was evaluating a structural component. Then she said something I didn't catch because it was fast and quiet and aimed at the floor, and my implant only got the tail of it, which was built like they make you on purpose to break. "Sorry," I said. "Your skeleton," she said louder, "it is not optimized for combat." "I know," I said. "And yet you are here," she said. "I am here," I agreed. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that I was beginning to understand was not hostile. It was something more like analytical curiosity. The way you might look at a piece of equipment you hadn't seen before that was doing something unexpected. "Strike me," she said. I blinked. I'm not going to strike you." "Why not?" "Because I gestured vaguely at her, meaning, you are 8 inches taller than me and built like a structural column, and we are not at war, and I don't know what unit protocols are here, and also I don't especially want to hit someone for no clear reason." She said, "If you cannot strike when instructed, you cannot learn defense when instructed. Strike me." I struck her. It was a controlled jab, the kind I'd practiced thousands of times in training, and it landed exactly where I aimed it. The center of her sternum, which in a human context is an excellent targeting choice because its central mass. It rocks the body's balance, and it's difficult to guard effectively while also maintaining your own attacking posture. In a Kethar context, it was approximately like punching a reinforced wall. She didn't move. I mean that literally. She didn't shift her weight. She didn't blink. The only thing that happened was that she looked down at my fist, which was still in contact with her sternum, and then back up at me. "Again," she said, "commit." I committed, 3 strikes in a combination, the way I'd been trained. Left jab to the sternum, right cross to the jaw line, which in her case meant my arm was fully extended upward, and a body shot to the ribs. She caught the body shot. Not blocked, caught. Her hand closed around my fist with a grip I could feel all the way to my shoulder and held it there, not crushing, just immovably present. "Your power is sufficient," she said. "Your angles are wrong. For your size, you should not fight Kethar as if you are Kethar size. Your advantage is different." She released my hand. "What is my advantage?" I asked. Ritha tilted her head. "It's a Kethar gesture that means something like, 'Let me think about how to phrase this for you.' You are small," she said. "You are fast for your mass. Your center of gravity is lower than ours. Your skeleton, though fragile, is flexible in directions ours is not." She paused. "You can go places in a fight that we cannot follow." I stared at her. "You should not try to hit as hard as us," she continued. "You should hit where we cannot be hit by us." I thought about that for a second. "You're saying I should fight from the inside." She looked at me differently. Something in the analytical expression shifted slightly toward what I was learning to read as Kethar approval, which is a very subtle thing involving the inner set of eyelids and a particular angle of the head. "Yes," she said, "exactly that. I trained with them for 4 hours. I should have left after 20 minutes. Once I'd figured out that the door's interior release panel was a green biometric plate at shoulder height, Kethar shoulder height, which was above my head, but I spotted it eventually. I should have pressed it and walked out and gone and checked in at the integration briefing office and confessed to whoever was running that office that I'd accidentally ended up somewhere I shouldn't be. Instead, I stayed for 4 hours and learned more in those 4 hours about combat, about my own body's capabilities and limitations, and about what it actually means to fight from a position of physical disadvantage than I had in all of my formal military training combined. Here is what those 4 hours contained, in roughly chronological order. Ritha teaching me to close distance against a taller opponent in a way that uses your own smaller frame as a structural tool rather than a liability. The principle is counterintuitive. You don't fight to get out of the pocket, you fight to get deeper in it, because an opponent built for longer reach can't generate their full power at close range, and inside their guard you're in a zone they physically can't follow you into. Ritha demonstrated this 3 times at reduced speed and then once at 60%, and by the 3rd demonstration I understood it not in my brain but in my body. The Varuk, whose name was something my implant rendered phonetically as Kara, and whose 4 arms I had been nervously aware of since I walked in, spending 12 minutes watching me move before saying, in a voice that my implant translated with a particular flat tone that might have been humor, "You compensate for your species' weakness by moving as if you are not your species. This is either intelligent or delusional." And then working with me on footwork patterns that she explained were designed for species significantly lighter and faster than Kethar, which, she noted, included me. Vesa finally coming to where I was training with Ritha and standing at the edge of the mat and watching for about 3 minutes without speaking. And then she said to Ritha, not to me, "It adapts quickly." Ritha said, "It thinks while it moves. Most integration transfers don't." They both looked at me. "What unit are you assigned to?" Vesa asked. And here is where I finally did the honest thing. "I'm not," I said. "I think I'm in the wrong place. I was looking for section 22 teal and I followed the wrong floor marking." There was a silence. It was a specific kind of silence, not the silence of outrage or the silence of amusement. The silence of a room full of professional soldiers who have just received information that was not what they expected and who are collectively processing it at the speed their respective species operate at, which varies. Then Vesa said, "You followed the wrong floor marking for 4 hours." "I realized I could open the door after about 20 minutes, I said. "Then I stayed." Another silence. Then, and this is the part I still think about, Ritha made a sound. A short, hard sound that my translation implant initially rendered as uncertain before recalibrating to laughter. Part 3. What the unit was. The unit was called the Kethar Vanguard, which is a name that translates cleanly into English and means almost exactly what it sounds like. The Vanguard is not an ordinary military unit. It's not even an ordinary special forces unit, which is the closest human concept I had to map it onto. The Kethar Vanguard is something older than those categories. Vesa explained it to me over the next hour, after the training session ended, and the unit regrouped in the secondary chamber adjacent to the main training space. A room that turned out to serve the function of a common area, with low platforms that the Kethar used as seating and a food synthesis terminal and a communications console. They brought me along. I'm still not entirely certain whether they brought me along as a guest, as a curiosity, or as someone they had tacitly decided was staying, until they collectively made a decision about what to do with me. The Kethar Vanguard, Vesa said, traces its lineage to a form of military organization that predates the Galactic Cooperative by several hundred years. Before the GC existed, before there were treaties and diplomatic frameworks and interspecies agreements about the laws of war and the rights of prisoners, there was a period of conflict that the Kethar call the Vetharan, which translates loosely as the Long Argument. Centuries of territorial warfare between species that didn't yet have the infrastructure to stop fighting. The Vanguard originated as a Kethar solution to a specific problem that arose during the Long Argument, the problem of coordinated combat across multiple species in shifting alliance structures. When your allies change, and when your allies are physically very different from you and have different tactical strengths and weaknesses and different cultural frameworks for what combat means, how do you fight together without fragmenting under pressure? The answer the Kethar developed was the Vanguard model. Small units, deliberately multi-species, training together at a level of intensity and duration that goes far beyond what most joint military frameworks require. Not just learning each other's tactics, but mapping each other. Vesa used that word specifically. Mapping. Understanding each other's bodies and instincts and reflexes and breaking points so thoroughly that in the field under fire, with communication possibly disrupted and certainty completely gone, you still know exactly how the person next to you is going to move. It is not alliance, Vesa said. Alliance is a political concept. What we are is closer to a single organism that happens to be made of 9 different bodies. 10, Ritha said and looked at me. 9, Vesa said. 9 and possibly 10, Ritha amended. I looked between them. I started. You stayed, Kara said, from where she was occupying about a third of the room by herself, her 4 arms folded in a configuration that looked like rest. In Vorak culture, remaining in a combat space when you could have left is a declaration of intent. In human culture, I said carefully, it was mostly me being unable to make a decision. Perhaps, Kara said, but you also learned. You implemented what Ritha showed you within the session. That is not nothing. I didn't say anything for a moment because I wasn't sure what to say to that. Vesa was watching me with the particular quality of attention she seemed to give everything, total, quiet, evaluative. What is your assignment on this station? She asked. I told her. 7th Human Rapid Integration Detachment, Support and Liaison Function. Here to learn how Veth Mora operates. Learn, she repeated, like the word meant something specific. Yes, I said, observe and learn, that's the assignment. Then you are in the right place, Vesa said. And that was the end of that conversation, as far as she was concerned, because she turned to address the unit about something in Rapid Kethar that my implant couldn't fully keep up with, and the discussion moved on. I sat there and tried to figure out whether I had just been absorbed into a Kethar Special Forces unit, or whether this was still some kind of extended misunderstanding that was going to resolve itself. It did not resolve itself, not then, not for a while. I reported to the Integration Briefing Office in Section 22 till the following morning. I was 7 hours late for my check-in. The officer running the office was a thin-faced human woman named Lieutenant Commander Yetund Fasiku, who looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has been managing an administrative problem all morning and has now been presented with the source of that problem in person. "Corporal Akafer," she said, "where were you?" I explained where I'd been, as accurately as I could. Fasiku listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Kethar Vanguard unit currently on Veth Mora." "Yes, ma'am." "And Commander Vesa allowed you to remain for the duration of a full training session." She didn't tell me to leave." Corporal Akafer, Commander Vesa of the Kethar Vanguard, has been stationed on this hub for 11 days and has, in that time, refused 3 formally arranged cultural exchange sessions, returned 14 invitations to joint diplomatic dinners without response, and physically redirected a senior cooperative administration officer who tried to enter her unit's training space by picking him up and placing him in the corridor outside. I thought about that. "She's very direct," I said. "She didn't pick you up and put you in the corridor," Fasiku said. "She let you train." "Ritham made me participate," I said. "I think the difference might be that I was already inside when she noticed me." Fasiku tapped something on her desk display. She looked at it for a moment, then at me. "The Vanguard is here because there is a situation developing in the Kethar-adjacent space sectors," she said. "I am going to tell you this because the situation is now partially your problem, and you should understand why." I sat forward in my chair. "The situation," Fasiku explained, "was this. There was a faction of rogue military contractors." She used the word contractors with the specific inflection that means mercenaries, and the even more specific inflection that means mercenaries who have crossed lines that the GC does not officially acknowledge the existence of. The faction operated under a variety of commercial fronts, but their actual function was enforcement for a consortium of resource extraction entities operating in disputed boundary sectors near the Kethar territorial edge. They had, 3 weeks ago, done something that the GC's diplomatic channels were still trying to process the implications of. They had attacked a Kethar civilian transport, not a military vessel. A transport carrying approximately 200 noncombatants, primarily family units, in the transit corridor between 2 Kethar colony systems. The transport had survived. Most of the people on it had survived, but it had been a close thing, and the attackers had done something particularly pointed in the aftermath. They had transmitted footage of the attack, edited, to a selection of media and political channels across 12 species networks. The edited footage made it look like a Kethar military vessel had attacked and then claimed victim status. False flag footage, designed to destabilize Kethar standing in the GC. "The Vanguard had been dispatched to Veth Mora," Fasiku said, "because Veth Mora was close to the relevant sector, and because someone in the GC's security apparatus had determined that the mercenary consortium's next move was going to involve the station in some way." "In what way?" I asked. "We are not certain," Fasiku said, "which is part of the problem. The Vanguard is operating with incomplete intelligence, and they have been refused integration support through formal channels because there are political complications around officially acknowledging that the GC is conducting security operations in response to the attack. Because officially acknowledging it would mean officially acknowledging the false flag footage is false," I said. "Yes," Fasiku said. "Which would require the GC to then also officially investigate which consortium members were responsible, and several of those consortium members have significant commercial relationships with GC member species who are not eager for that conversation." I stared at her. "So the Vanguard is here, protecting a station against a threat we don't fully understand without official support." "They are the Kethar Vanguard," Fasiku said. "They do not require official support. They require, on occasion, informal information." She looked at me very carefully. "Corporal Akafer, You have managed to establish some form of working relationship with Commander Vesa in less than 12 hours, which is a thing that several senior officers on this station have been trying to do for 11 days. I didn't establish a relationship, I said. I wandered in by accident and didn't leave. Sometimes, Fasiku said, those are the same thing. Part 5. The problem with intelligence networks. I went back to the Vanguard section of the station the following morning, not because anyone ordered me to. Technically, I was still on free assignment status, while Fasiku sorted out my official posting, but because the alternative was staying in the human residential wing, drinking the worst coffee in the galaxy, and staring at the curved gray wall. The door was the same door, status light green. I put my hand on the entry panel. Then I thought, last time I walked through this door by accident. Walking through it on purpose is different. I thought about that for about 30 seconds. Then I walked through it. The training session was already in progress. Vesa saw me come in. She looked at me for one long moment, then turned back to what she'd been doing. I took that as permission and moved to the edge of the space and waited. Ritha broke from her current drill after about 5 minutes and came over. "You are back," she said. "I am back," I agreed. "You spoke to someone," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I checked in with my unit command," I said. "I was late for my check-in." "And?" I looked at her. "And I'm told there's a threat situation on the station, and your unit is here responding to it without official support structure." Ritha's inner eyelids moved in a way I was starting to be able to read. "Your command told you this?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because apparently I accidentally ingratiated myself with your commander in a way that several people who tried on purpose couldn't manage." Ritha looked at me for a long moment. Then she did the short, hard sound again, the laughter. "Yes," she said, "that sounds correct." She turned toward the center of the room. "Vesa," she called, "the human has information." Vesa crossed the space in about 4 seconds, which sounds like a normal amount of time and is not, because the space was about 30 meters across. "What information?" she said. I told her what Fasiku had told me, concisely, watching Vesa's expression the whole time. She didn't react much to most of it. When I got to the part about the commercial consortium and the political complications, something in her jaw tightened very slightly. It was a small movement, and I would not have caught it if I hadn't spent the previous session watching Kethar faces and trying to learn their tells. When I finished, Vesa was quiet for a moment. "Your command sent you here," she said. "Not exactly," I said. "My command told me things and left the next step unspecified. I made my own decision." "Why?" I thought about how to answer that. "Because it seemed like the useful thing to do," I said. "And because if there's something moving against this station, I'm on the station." Vesa looked at me for a long time. The quality of that look was different from any she'd directed at me before. Less evaluative, maybe, more something else. I didn't have the Kethar vocabulary to read it precisely. "What is your name?" she said. "Akefar," I said. "Divin Akefar." "Akefar," she repeated. The sound of it in Kethar accent was different, the consonants harder, the vowels longer. "If you are staying, you train." "Yes," I said. "And if you train with us, you carry what we carry," she said. "We do not have partial members. We do not have observers. If you are in this space, you are in this unit." I looked around the room. 8 women, Ritha, Kara. 6 others I'd begun to develop names for in my head, all watching me with varying degrees of curiosity and something that might have been assessment. "Okay," I said. "Okay," Vesa repeated, and I could not tell from her tone whether she was mimicking me or agreeing. She turned back to the room. "Integration exercises, full contact, Akafar in the rotation." "Full contact." I opened my mouth, then closed it. Ritha appeared at my elbow. You survived yesterday, she said. Today you will also survive, differently. Part 6. Full Contact. Surviving full contact combat training with the Cathar Vanguard is an experience I would describe as educational in the same way that being struck by lightning is educational. Technically informative, not comfortable. Producing a kind of clarity that you couldn't have achieved through safer means. I went through the rotation with 7 of the 9 unit members over the course of the next 3 hours. My first partner was a woman named Tiessa, a Cathar who was younger than Vesa and older than Ritha, with a fighting style that was almost entirely defined by economy. She didn't move until she needed to, and when she did move it was precisely and terminally. Meaning, she was not violent in an aggressive or uncontrolled way. Every movement she made was calibrated. Every contact she made with me during the spar landed in exactly the place she intended it, with exactly the force she intended, and every time she had an opportunity to end the exchange she took it, brought it to the point of conclusion, and then released rather than following through. This is called marking in the Vanguard's vocabulary. You identify the ending point and make contact with it without completing the impact. It's a training discipline that requires extraordinary control because you have to be fully committed to the movement all the way up to the point of termination. You can't pull back early, that's not marking, that's flinching, and they all knew the difference. You have to hit the mark. Tiessa marked me 9 times in 3 minutes. I marked her twice, both by accident. I was trying for different targets and my aim was bad enough that I ended up in positions she hadn't predicted, and the unpredictability was what got through. She acknowledged both marks by pausing the exchange, touching the spot I'd hit, and nodding. "Your chaos is your weapon," she said, not unkindly, almost warmly. My second partner was a woman I came to know as Myra, not her actual name, which was about 6 syllables of Cathar phonemes my implant rendered as something vaguely like Muravel, but she had introduced herself with the 2-syllable version, and I decided to use it. Myra fought differently from Tiessa. Where Tiessa was economical, Myra was spatial. She was constantly repositioning, not retreating, never retreating, but rotating the geometry of the exchange so that I was always reorienting. Fighting her was like fighting someone who was always standing in a different place than where she'd just been. With Myra, I lasted 4.5 minutes before she marked me. That was not because I was doing anything particularly right. It was because figuring out how to orient myself to a constantly moving opponent was actually something my training had addressed. And the solution, don't chase the person, anchor to the space, was an approach she hadn't expected from me. "You use the room," she said when the exchange paused. "I was taught to," I said. "We all use the room," she said. "You use it the way someone who knows they are smaller uses it. That is different." My third partner was Kara. I have to say something about fighting Kara, which is that it wasn't really fighting in any sense my training had prepared me for. Kara has 4 arms. In practice, this means she has 4 independent attack vectors at all times, and they don't function as left-right paired units the way human arms do. She can simultaneously block high with one arm, block low with another, strike mid with a third, and do something complicated that I couldn't identify until after it had already happened with the 4th. It's not that she's 4 times as difficult as a human opponent. It's that the entire conceptual framework of close-quarters combat you've been trained in is based on an assumption about bilateral symmetry that simply does not apply. I lasted about 40 seconds before Kara marked me in 3 places simultaneously, 1 on each collarbone and 1 at the base of my sternum, and then held me there for a moment, all 4 hands making contact, not with pressure, just with presence, and said, "Do you understand what just happened? You addressed 3 attack vectors simultaneously while maintaining guard with the 4th, I said. "Yes," she said. "What does that tell you?" "That I need to not be the only thing you're focused on," I said. Kara released me. The flat-affect face of the Vorak can't convey warmth in the way humanoid faces can. But something changed in the sensor cluster around her eyes that I read gut level as approval. Yes, she said, exactly that. In a unit, you will never fight Vorak alone. You fight everything else, and we fight where you cannot. Part 7. The night the station changed. I was eating in the human cafeteria, because the Vanguard's food synthesis terminal, while generous, produced things calibrated for Kethar and Vorak metabolisms that a human digestive system had opinions about, when the station's ambient light shifted. It was subtle, the kind of thing you might not notice if you weren't paying attention. The light dropped about 3% in intensity, and the color temperature shifted very slightly toward cool. On Veth Mora, that's a level 2 security condition. Not an alert. Alerts use different signals. A condition, which means something has changed in the threat environment, operations continue, personnel at specific posts take specific actions, everyone else continues normal activity while remaining aware. Most of the other humans in the cafeteria didn't notice or didn't know the signal. I noticed, because Fasiku had spent about an hour of my integration briefing running me through Veth Mora's communication system. I put down my food and went back to the Vanguard section. The door status light was green. I went through. The training space was configured differently. The combat mats had been pushed to the perimeter. In the center of the room, there was a holographic display that hadn't been there before. A tactical map of Veth Mora and the surrounding space, including approach corridors, docking hardpoints, and a section of the display I couldn't read because it was in a Kethar classification format my clearance didn't include. Vesa was at the display. The full unit was assembled. They were all in different kit from the training sessions, not armor, not fully, but a base layer that had the look and weight of something that precedes armor. Vesa looked up when I came in. "You saw the shift," she said. "Yes," I said. "Your people are monitoring it." "I don't know," I said honestly. "I should report to my command." "Do that," she said, "then come back." I reported to Fasiku by comm. Fasiku confirmed that the level 2 condition had been triggered by an anomalous docking approach in Corridor 7. A vessel that had transmitted correct credentials, but was behaving in ways that didn't match the vessel type those credentials belonged to. A light cargo runner that was maneuvering with the profile of something significantly heavier. "How heavy?" I asked. "Heavy enough," Fasiku said. "We're working on confirming. The Cooperative Administration Security is managing the docking protocol, but they're slow and the vessel is fast." I went back to the Vanguard. Vesa was still at the display when I returned. I told her what Fasiku had told me. She looked at the display and said something quietly to Ritha in Rapid Kethar that my implant caught the shape of but not the specifics. Then she turned to me. "Docking Corridor 7, she said. "Yes. That corridor terminates 60 meters from this section," she said. I hadn't known that. I understood, looking at the map, why that fact was significant. "They know you're here," I said. "Someone knows we're here," Vesa said. "Someone has known for 11 days, and someone has now made a decision." She looked at me steadily. "You should not be here for what comes next." I looked back at her. "Why not?" "Because you are not Vanguard," she said. "You are a human corporal who wandered into our training space by accident and showed surprising potential and an interesting willingness to stay. That does not make you equipped for this." "I know," I said. "I'm also the only person on this station who currently has a working relationship with your unit, which means if something goes wrong and your unit needs interface with the station's systems or command structure, the interface person is me." Vesa regarded me. Something in her expression was doing the thing again, the thing I couldn't fully read. "I can be useful," I said. "Even if I'm not Vanguard, I can be useful as what I am." Vesa looked at Ritha. Ritha looked at me. He argues well, she said. He argues as if arguing will change outcomes, Vesa said. Sometimes it does, I said. Vesa was quiet for a long moment. Then, stay behind the unit line. Do not advance. If we give ground, you give ground faster. Understood? Understood, I said. Kara handed me something, a piece of equipment that I recognized after a moment as a personal shield emitter. Small, clipped to a belt, generates a short-range deflection field that's not impervious, but provides meaningful resistance to energy weapons at medium range. Military-grade equipment that would normally require about 6 layers of authorization for me to be carrying. Vorak military hardware, she said. It does not require authorization codes. It simply requires being alive enough to activate it. Thank you, I said. Do not thank me, she said. Survive. Part 8, Corridor 7. The next 90 minutes are the part of this story that I have told least often to the most people, which is paradoxical, but there's a reason for it. It's not that it's classified, it's not, or at least the public parts aren't. It's that the experience of being in a combat engagement, even a relatively contained one, even one where you're technically behind the unit line and operating in a support capacity, doesn't translate well to words. The sequence is wrong. What you remember isn't linear. You remember images and physical sensations and specific sounds, and the texture of the wall you pressed yourself against at one point, and the smell of the air when the weapons started firing. But here is what happened, as linearly as I can reconstruct it. The vessel that docked in Corridor 7 was not a light cargo runner. The credentials it had transmitted were stolen from a legitimate operator 3 months earlier. What it actually was, a heavily modified insertion transport carrying a contingent of 17 contracted soldiers, mercenaries with military-grade equipment and a specific tasking, which was later determined to be the seizure or elimination of the Vanguard unit that the consortium had somehow identified as a threat to their operations. 17 against 9. With me making it 9, and a confused human corporal behind the unit line. The Kethar Vanguard knew they were coming about 4 minutes before the docking clamps released. Vesa had access to sensor data. I didn't understand the sourcing of it later. I learned the unit had placed their own passive monitors along the approach corridors because they had been operating under the assumption that something like this was possible. The 4-minute warning was not a lot of time. It was exactly enough. The Vanguard set up in a corridor junction about 25 meters from the docking airlock. The junction was a choice I understood once I saw it. 3 approach angles, which meant the attacking force had to split or funnel, and splitting reduced their numerical advantage while funneling created a predictable engagement zone. I was behind and to the right, at a position Vesa had pointed me to without explanation, which I later understood was the junction's communication node, a panel in the wall that gave access to the station's intercom and alert systems. The implication was obvious. If the unit needed me to escalate to a station-wide alert, this was where I could do it. I had my sidearm, standard human military issue, energy pulse, 12-round cell. I had the Vorak shield emitter clipped to my belt. I had a wall at my back and a view of the junction, and 9 of the most prepared combat specialists I had ever encountered positioned between me and what was about to come through the airlock. The airlock cycled. Here is what the Kethar Vanguard fighting looks like, when they're not training, when the parameters are real. It looks like language. That's the only way I can describe it. It looks like something that has a grammar, a logic. Each movement isn't an isolated action, it's a word in a sentence. Vesa takes a position, and Ritha responds to that position before Vesa has finished taking it, and Tiesa responds to Ritha's response, and the whole unit shifts and breathes and engages as if they are made of the same connective tissue running the same intention. The Kamar drills I'd watched and participated in, that was the vocabulary. This was the language. The mercenary force was not incompetent. I want to be clear about that. They were equipped and organized, and they had tactical structure. They came through the airlock in a coherent formation with overlapping fields of fire, and they had clearly done this kind of thing before. Under most circumstances, with most opponents, they would have been extremely effective. They were not, in this case, fighting most opponents. What happened in the next 11 minutes in that corridor, I won't describe every exchange because I couldn't see all of it from my position, and because some of what I did see I still process imperfectly. What I will say is this. 3 times, the mercenary unit tried to flank the vanguard's position. 3 times, the flank was already covered before the flanking move had completed, as if the vanguard had seen it before it happened. This wasn't prescience. It was the result of thousands of hours of exactly the kind of training I'd watched and participated in, the Kamar methodology, the mutual mapping, the 9 bodies that functioned as one organism. Each member knew how the others would move, and so each member could move to where they were needed before being directed there. Kara's 4 arms. In the confined space of a corridor junction, a Vorok with 4 independent weapon-capable limbs in a unit that knows exactly how to position around her is not an opponent you can engage effectively with superior numbers. The numbers don't apply in the same way because 4 arms aren't just double the weapons. They're double the engagement directions, and the unit around her made sure she always had the angles she needed. Ritha fought the way she described fighting against larger opponents, from the inside, from positions that the opposing soldiers couldn't easily reach, in the pockets and blind spots that her speed and smaller-than-Kethar average frame allowed her to occupy. I watched her neutralize 3 opponents without being hit once, moving through the junction like water through gaps. My part in all of this was small and unglamorous, and I think probably exactly right. I stayed at the communication node. When Vesa glanced back at me twice during the first 6 minutes, I read those glances as status check, and I gave her a thumb gesture I'd seen her unit use to mean holding position, stable, nothing requiring escalation yet. When 2 of the mercenary soldiers broke from the main engagement and moved toward my position, not because they'd specifically identified me as a target, I think, but because I was a target of opportunity, I activated the Vorok shield emitter and fired my sidearm 3 times. I hit twice. The shield took a deflection from the 3rd shot fired at me. And then Kara was there, having simply reached past me with 2 of her 4 arms and resolved the situation in about a second and a half. And then she was gone again, back into the engagement. The 11th minute, Vesa did something I have never been able to adequately describe, which is that she moved through the remaining focused group of mercenary soldiers in a straight line, not around them, through them, as if they were not arranged in a way that presented obstacles, which they were, but as if she had looked at the arrangement and identified the single path that threaded every gap, and had then simply taken that path at a speed that didn't give the arrangement time to close. She reached the one individual who had stayed back from the main engagement, who had the bearing of a commander, who had clearly been managing the operation from behind the engaged line, and she stopped in front of him and looked at him, and he put his weapon down. That was how it ended. Not with a dramatic final moment, with a decision, with someone looking at the situation, looking at the unit that was now regrouping around them, looking at the mathematics of the remaining positions, and making the only rational choice available. Part 9. After. The Cooperative Administration Security Force arrived 14 minutes after the engagement concluded, which tells you something about the Cooperative Administration Security response time. They found 17 mercenary personnel in containment, not killed, all of them, which was a choice the Vanguard had made, because the intelligence value of living prisoners significantly outweighs the relative cleanliness of a corridor with no witnesses. Vesa had communicated this to the unit in a 3-word instruction during the engagement that my implant caught as capture, not conclusion. 3 words that changed the operation's entire approach. The CA security team spent about 6 minutes trying to understand the situation. Then their commanding officer, a Velothian who I'd seen in passing around the station but never interacted with, looked at the Vanguard, looked at me standing at the communication node, looked at the containment situation, and said, in precise galactic standard, "This is not what we were briefed to expect." "No," Vesa said. "You are not authorized to conduct security operations on this station." "No," Vesa said again. "And yet," the Velothian said, surveying the corridor. "And yet," Vesa agreed. The politics of the aftermath took about 6 weeks and were conducted entirely above my pay grade. What eventually happened, as Fasiku explained to me in the debrief, and as I later read in the public GC record, was that the captured mercenaries provided the intelligence that led to formal identification and eventual prosecution of the consortium's senior command structure. The false flag footage was formally debunked. 3 GC member species that had been delaying that debunking for commercial reasons were publicly, quietly, embarrassed by the revelation of exactly why they'd been delaying, which turned out to be a more effective deterrent than formal sanctions would have been. The Kethar Vanguard left Vethmora approximately 2 weeks after the engagement in Corridor 7. They had been officially thanked by the cooperative administration in language so carefully calibrated as to imply nothing about the unauthorized nature of their operations, while communicating complete gratitude for the outcome. Vesa came to find me before they departed. I was in the human residential wing, which is where I'd technically been assigned, and where I'd been sleeping approximately 40% of the nights since the whole thing started. She stood in the corridor outside my bunk assignment and told me, in English, which she had apparently been more able to understand than she'd let on during any of our previous conversations, that I had been useful. "I know what I was," I said. "I held a communication node and fired my sidearm twice." "3 times, she said. 2 hits. "Right. And you provided intelligence that we did not have," she said, "and you remained when you could have left, both times." I looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" "You will ask regardless of my answer," she said, which was fair. "The first day," I said, "when I walked in by accident, you knew immediately. You could tell I wasn't an integration transfer." She waited. "But you let me stay. Why?" Vesa was quiet for a moment. The Kethar inner eyelids moved in the way that meant something I still couldn't fully read. "Because you were interested," she said finally. "Not performing interest. Not doing what someone told you to do in order to achieve a result. Interested." A pause. "Most beings come to us because they want something from us. You came to us because you followed the wrong floor marking. You stayed because you wanted to understand." "Is that enough?" I said. "It was that day," she said. She left. Part 10. What I carried out. I've been asked since what I learned from the whole experience. My official debrief was about 4 hours and covered tactical observations, intelligence protocols, the specific capabilities of the Vorak shield emitter, and the security vulnerabilities in Vethmora's docking credential verification system that the mercenaries had exploited. All useful, all filed. What I actually learned is harder to catalog. I learned that the body is a different kind of intelligence than the mind. That Rithash showing me how to close distance against a larger opponent was giving me something that my training manual's chapter on close quarters combat had been gesturing at, but hadn't quite transmitted. The felt sense of how a body with different physical parameters than yours occupies space, and what that means for where you can be relative to it. I learned that fighting from disadvantage is not about overcoming the disadvantage. It's about understanding exactly what the disadvantage is, and then finding the positions and angles and moments where it doesn't apply. I learned something about the Kamar methodology that I've been thinking about ever since. The idea that a unit is not a collection of individuals with coordinated tactics. A unit is a single thing made of multiple bodies, and the quality of that single thing depends entirely on how well each body knows every other body. Not tactically, not cognitively, physically, intuitively, the way you know your own arm. The Vanguard had built that over years of training together. It was not something you could fast-track. But the principle, the idea that cooperation at the deepest level requires genuine, physical, repeated knowledge of another, that principle scales. I think about it in every team context I've been in since. And I learned something about Vessa's answer to my question, about staying because you want to understand rather than because you're trying to achieve something. I don't know if I'd call it a philosophy. It's more like a practice. You show up. You're present. You don't perform interest. You're actually interested, even when the interesting thing is confusing or uncomfortable or happening in a room where you're clearly the least capable person. Sometimes, if you do that consistently enough, the room reclassifies you. Not as one of them. I was never Vanguard. That's a specific thing earned over years that I spent 4 days adjacent to. I'm not confusing proximity with membership. But I wasn't just a human corporal who got lost anymore, either. I was something the Vanguard had experienced, and I had experienced the Vanguard, and that reciprocal experience changed what each of us understood about what the other was capable of. Epilogue: a note on doors. I've been back to Vethmora twice since then. The first time was part of an official liaison assignment that came about partly because of the Corridor 7 incident and the relationships it had inadvertently established. The second time was personal. I requested the posting, which required about 7 months of bureaucratic effort that I won't bore you with. The Vanguard unit wasn't there either time. They operate across a territory too large for me to accidentally overlap with again under most circumstances. But the section of the station they'd used, Section 14 Deep, which was the actual designation, not anything related to teal or cyan, was still there. Still had the dark alloy walls with the slow bioluminescent pulse. Still had the aggressive grip floor. The second time I went back, I went in and stood in the middle of the training space for about 10 minutes. It was empty. The weapons racks were there but bare. The combat mats were stacked at the perimeter. It smelled the same. That particular combination of metal and exertion, and the faint chemical signature of Kethar's skin that I have never smelled anywhere else and apparently cannot forget. I thought about Rithas saying, "Your chaos is your weapon." I thought about Kara saying, "Survive." I thought about Vessa in the corridor outside my bunk saying you were interested in English she'd known all along. Then I walked back out. The door status light shifted from green to red as it sealed behind me. I stood in the corridor for a moment. Then I went and found the blue-green floor marking, the one I'd followed the first time, the one that had taken me to Section 22 Teal by the longest and most consequential possible route, and I followed it in the other direction, toward wherever it went from here. Some doors, once you've walked through them, you never really walk back out of. You just carry them with you into every room you enter after.